Director John Howe brings us WOLFSHEAD, the legend of Robin Hood, also known as the adventures of young Robin Hood. This is a 1973 movie that was originally made as a pilot for a TV show that was never picked up. And this is actually produced by Hammer Films. Yes, that's Hammer Films, and stars David Warbeck as Robert of Loxley, aka Robin Hood. Now, Robin of Sherwood, which was an 80s TV show, it still remains today one of my favourite shows of all time. And this one obviously precedes that, and it seems like a somewhat of an evolution from the kind of the Errol Flynn sort of style movies that came before that to the more modern, grittier versions of Robin Hood that we got from the 80s up until today. I mean, this was a somewhat of a little known film to a certain degree because ultimately it was a failed TV pilot, and thus, you know, maybe some people haven't kind of seen this. But it's an interesting little Robin Hood story that is surprisingly dark in tone. So the story focuses on Robert of Loxley, played by David Warbeck, who at the beginning of this film is a farmer who helps a runaway serf, and this angers the authority. In this case, it's Roger of Barnstable, I believe, and to kind of add to the matters that Robert of Loxley has a kind of interest in the maid Marian, which also our main bad guy, Roger of Barnstable, has a somewhat of a connection to Marian as well. So there's somewhat of a love triangle there. And this ultimately propels our bad guys to frame Robert of Loxley for killing Dio, when in actual fact he hasn't. So this kind of puts him as a wolf's head, which is a term used to say your life is worth less than a wolf's. And his family is killed, his workers are killed, and he has to kind of go on the run. And the story really focuses on Robert of Loxley now using the pseudonym of Robin Hood to try and disguise himself, building up his band of merry men and ultimately deepening the kind of the rivalry, so to speak, with the Normans. What will happen? You will have to watch this movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie's favour. As I've said, this is a surprisingly gritty adaptation of the Robin Hood mythos. Gone is the kind of the jovial playfulness that you often see in the character of Robin Hood. David Warbeck's character is stoic and moody, and you know, it certainly has gravitas because of that, I would say. It's surprising, actually, the level of kind of graphicness this has, how Robin Hood's family is kind of slaughtered and how he has to bury them and things like this. I mean, bear in mind, this was going to be a pilot for a TV show in the 70s. It seems somewhat kind of dark in some aspects, especially when you consider the Robin Hood media up until this point. But nonetheless, I do think it gives it that element of kind of the grittier feel that maybe you'd see more recently in the kind of the adaptations of the kind of the Robin Hood mythos. So I kind of quite liked it to a certain degree, I have to say. And I will say, despite this, the version I saw being a VHS rip, it's relatively well shot. There's some kind of nice sequences here where, you know, we have our band of merry men against this kind of burning village and things like that, and it kind of looks a little bit, you know, fantasy-like, if that makes sense. So I kind of quite like some of the shots here. I quite like some of the elements that are introduced in regards to Robin Hood finding this, or being gifted this Welsh bow, which is actually like an illegal weapon in England because it's ultimately so powerful. And this ultimately sets now Robin Hood as his signature weapon, this Welsh bow, which can kind of means his arrows can kind of pierce armour and things like this. So he kind of has this like illegal weapon, which I thought was kind of quite fun. And then we get some kind of like, you know, classic moments. For example, the duel with Little John on the kind of the log over the kind of the river. So it does have familiar elements that you would have seen in other kind of Robin Hood kind of legends and stuff like that. So it's it's somewhat familiar, but I do feel it carves out somewhat of its own voice as well. Perhaps the fact that it was a little bit darker, a little bit more gritty, is the reason why this particular movie never got picked up as a kind of TV show. But you can see the influence, I would say, of the Hammer films on this kind of movie, obviously based on the time that it was made. It does feel as a comparable piece to a degree with Hammer films at that time, I would certainly suggest. I think David Warbeck actually does a pretty good job here. I mean, I have seen some criticism that his character is too serious, but I gotta say I thought it made his character somewhat tragic, to be honest. And like he really is just forced to kind of be like this against his kind of will, which gives him this reluctant hero sort of type aesthetic, which I thought was quite fun. But you still get a kind of a fun character in Little John, who we kind of meet towards the end of this kind of sort of movie. And there's a couple of kind of action sequences that I think are pretty good. They're relatively low in stakes, because obviously, again, we have to remember this is a TV pilot rather than a large kind of production in regards to like a theatrical movie or anything like that. But I do still feel it benefits from being shot around the kind of these forests and castles and things like that. So it kind of has that sort of classic movie feel to a certain degree, with all these great kind of backdrops and location shoots and things like this. What doesn't work in this movie, I mean, like I said, I think maybe the tone wasn't right for the time. Maybe it was a little bit kind of too dour to a certain degree. Maybe I can see if this was made today, it'd probably catch on a lot more, but maybe in '73 people just weren't used to this tone for a kind of a Robin Hood series. But outside of that, I would say there is a couple of cheesier elements, particularly in the first half of this movie still. It really lacks in characterization. It has to be my biggest argument here. I really don't feel like we got to know any of the characters. Had this been maybe a feature length, like another sort of half an hour or so, I felt maybe you would have got to know certainly Robin Hood, Little John, Marion, who barely registers, I have to say, are Norman characters and things like that. But as it stands at the moment, I feel the characters here are kind of sorely lacking. One other element, or two other elements I felt were a little weak in this one as well. I think the music is a little misjudged. It has this kind of military sort of style drums that I feel is misplaced in a kind of like medieval kind of setting. I didn't really like the music. And the actual costumes, in particular Robin Hood and his kind of band of outlaws, they look like they're wearing costumes from like a Robin Hood pantomime. I think the Normans look a little better, to be honest. But our costumes that our band of outlaws wear, you can't help but think they kind of look like Robin Hood costumes rather than actual kind of clothing of the time. Now, I think maybe you can get away with it a little bit more in like the Errol Flynn era of Robin Hood movies, but in this, certainly for the tone that it's trying to put across here, it looks like costumes and like pantomime costumes. So there is that. And yeah, it's a little bit small scale if we're looking at it through the lens of a movie rather than a pilot for a TV show, which obviously was what it was actually made for. But it's an interesting little curio of what could have been in regards to the Robin Hood mythos. I would have liked to have seen really why this had gone. I probably would have watched it. It's maybe a 6 out of 10. I think the lack of characterization does harm it ultimately. But yeah, have you seen it? It's available to watch on YouTube. It's where I ended up watching it. Let me know what your thoughts are. If you have seen it, please do leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.